The most divisive story decision in the Game of Thrones ending, and probably in the entire series, is what ultimately wound up happening with Daenerys Targaryen's character. And there's kind of two schools of thought on this, and I've seen it's roughly 50-50. Half the people view her transformation into a genocidal maniac who slaughters tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, including her own soldiers and enemy soldiers who had surrendered, as a good thing. They said, look, we've seen this coming the whole time. This is a subversion of the savior narrative. Dany was not idealistic this whole time. She was just scum. She was just evil. And we're finally seeing it. We're finally seeing her true colors. And then the other side goes, okay, but this just came out of nowhere. This was obviously done just for shock value because they didn't have any ideas left. Cersei was defeated in like the first 10 minutes of the episode. So like we got this special effect budget left. Let's just have her go crazy and start blowing stuff up for the next 60 minutes. And these are kind of the two ideas. Either it was a good decision that was like this great inversion of the savior narrative, or it was the worst decision ever and it was just character assassination to shock people. So before I give my opinion, let's just talk a bit about Daenerys and how I feel about her. She's a character I've always had very, very mixed feelings about. Because on one hand, I agree with a lot of what she says. I agree with her trying to get rid of slavery. I agree with her trying to get a better deal for the small folk, for trying to clean up, I guess, the act of the lords in Westeros. Because in a sense, the ruling class of Westeros has failed so spectacularly with their like petty wars, their lust for revenge, etc., that by the time the War of Five Kings comes to an end, they have lost the mandate of heaven, as it were. They've lost kind of all right to rule. They violated their half of the feudal contract. So I respect that and I understand that. And I kind of agree with the people who just say, look, the whole system's just screwed. Let's just throw the dice on someone who's completely random. And I do think that, and I do think you do see Dany become more mature as time goes on. Now, on the other hand, the main reason I oppose her and why I was cheering for Cersei is because she was bringing 100,000 Dothraki across the Narrow Sea. The Dothraki are like the most evil, savage group of people on Earth. Their entire culture is literally based upon raping, pillaging. Like, you think they're going to demobilize quietly as soon as the war's over? No, they're going to go rape and pillage the countryside. There's 100,000 of them. They could break off into bands of a couple thousand and they'd set up their own kingdoms. It's an unmitigated disaster. At the end of the day, Dany doesn't really know anything about Westeros. She hasn't spent time there. She hasn't really interacted with the people there. She's utterly unprepared to be the queen of it. So I guess these are the kind of the two things you have with her. And people who like her or hate her, it kind of tends to come to down one of these. Is her inherent goodness, and while she has many flaws, I don't think you can deny that she does at some level believe she's doing the right thing. Not just for personal benefit, but she thinks she is trying to make the world a better place. Or are her many flaws, be it her arrogance, she acts all like a spoiled child, her complete inability to deal with things diplomatically. I find she's also she can't like do half measures, or she can't really do compromises. She either goes 100% merciful or 100% balls to the wall, kill everything that moves. So she has continually displayed poor judgment, but her judgment really isn't any worse than Joffrey or Cersei or Stannis or Robert or any of the other characters in the show. And it does seem she does have a bit more of this natural compassion and a natural desire to do good. So that being said, how do I view this? Do I think it was shown off? Do I think this did justice to her character, or was this just character assassination? I'm going to mainly go with the latter, but I'm going to qualify and explain it a bit more. So Dany has never shown any indication of killing civilians. She's shown plenty of times that she kills the leaders, that she kills the people she thinks are responsible. She sometimes even fails to show mercy to her enemies. But in terms of her killing random civilians, I can't remember that ever happening. So let's look at the people that Dany's killed in the past. Okay, so the first and most obvious example was the sack of Astapor, where she bought the Unsullied and then proceeded to kill the Masters. Now, this was obviously not a killing of innocents. The the masters of Astapor practiced chattel slavery, which is, in my opinion, one of the worst things that's ever been invented by humanity. Now, there's all kinds of different forms of what we would often call slavery, ranging from you owning someone's contract and you have a right to their labor, to them being your property. So, like, depending on the system, the person may still be a person. The slave might be a person, the master can't beat them, the master can't kill them, etc. But under chattel slavery, the person is literally property and the master can torture them, beat them, do whatever they want to them. They have absolutely no rights. So Dany, in her kind of first action of, I guess you could say, violence, slaughters the masters and sacks Astapor, which frankly I think was based. I was okay with that. I thought they were degenerate scumbags, and I'm glad that she took them down. Same thing with Yunkai. I have nothing against her going through and killing these like horrendous people. It doesn't really bother me. And then once we get to Meereen, I think we have to keep in mind with that is the masters there crucified like 163 children, slave children with their arms pointing towards Meereen. And that really pissed her off. And that ensured that she was going to kill a lot of people when she took over. So when she took over Meereen, she crucified a similar number of great masters as like a payback. Once again, though, this isn't really sadism or evil. She's not killing innocent people. She's killing the leadership of her enemies that she's at war with. They aren't really non-combatants in the same way that the people who make up King's Landing are. And I think it can be argued that they are necessarily combatants because they're slave owners that own people like property and treat them like garbage. So they are not innocent parties by any definition. Even putting aside the fact that this is a war we're in the middle of, and it's an actively declared war where both sides have agreed upon it being a war, no one can call the Gizgari upper class innocents. It's just, it's absurd. There's plenty of lords in Westeros who I guess you could say are innocent, where they just rule over their realm and they're fairly just and the small folk like them and things just run pretty well. You don't have that in Slaver's Bay. That's just not. It's called Slaver's Bay for crying out loud. When she ruled Meereen, the issue was she wasn't strong enough. She was expecting the upper class to behave like reasonable people. She was expecting that her compassionate rule would win her friends. The thing is, that probably would have worked in Westeros. People love Jaehaerys the Wise. People even like Baelor the Blessed. In Westeros, where you have the Seven, which is basically Christian values, Dany's style of leadership would have gone over really good. Some people might have thought she was naive, but the common people would have loved her. And a lot of the knights and lords would have been happy. So Dany has been getting progressively, I don't know if you want to say more violent or stronger, but she is kind of growing as a person and learning, okay, sometimes you have to be strong. Sometimes you have to do the unpleasant things that you don't want to do. Because if you don't, the situation can get a lot worse. The fact that she didn't crush the slave cities enough and kill enough of the upper class and make enough of an example early on meant she had to go back and do it again and cause another round of bloodshed. So when she gets to Westeros, does she behave in a sadistic fashion? No, Tyrion, for whatever reason, is like, no, we can't attack King's Landing. We can't attack it because that would be mean. Because trying to win this war would be mean. And I was thinking, yeah, but Tyrion not attacking King's Landing is worse. Because if we attack King's Landing, you take it, you kill Cersei, the war's over. The war's over and we can start rebuilding. Instead, by refusing to attack King's Landing and trying to do this 4D chess thing, you're going all over the continent. Her fleet got destroyed multiple times. They took Casterly Rock and then lost it. Highgarden got sacked. The whole thing was a disaster. And once again, to me, this is kind of a learning moment for Dany. She's like, okay, by not being strong enough, by not doing what needed to be done, I screwed us over, and a lot more people died as a result of that. So we do get this hardening of Dany. We do get her heading more and more in this direction. But once again, is this Mad Queen Dany? Is this her killing random people? No. I guess the darkest we see is her killing Randall and Dick and Tarly after they refused to bend the knee to her. Which you can say that was unnecessary, but it did make everybody else bend the knee to her. And they were her enemies. They were her enemies who she had defeated in battle, and they refused the terms of the surrender. So I think it was bad. I think she should have took them as hostages, but that's not killing innocent people. That was killing people who, like a couple minutes ago, were fighting her with fire and with sword and bow and stuff. So that's not the actions of a sociopath. That's the actions of a prince who's doing what they need to inspire the amount of fear they need to rule. Because if she doesn't kill people, then there's going to be no need to surrender. That's why I think people don't always understand why the sacking of cities happened during the medieval era. If you took a city by storm, you sacked it and burned it to the ground. Otherwise, there would be no incentive for cities to surrender. If the city surrenders, you get tribute maybe. You steal a bunch of stuff, but you don't loot the city. You don't rape and murder. You do that in part to set an example so that the next city will have to think whether or not they can realistically hold out. So once again, we haven't seen any trace of Mad Queen Dany yet. We can see her getting frustrated. And then we kind of head into the last couple episodes. And we do see her get kind of depressed. She realizes that her dream of being Queen of Westeros was kind of that, a dream. Nobody likes her there. Nobody trusts her. No one wants her to rule over them. She's gone from being the Messiah in Essos to being this, like, feared foreign queen who brought an army of, like, 100,000 savage rapists, a bunch of eunuchs, and dragons that eat people across the narrow sea. And understandably, that really, like, that scares people. And Dany has no tact. She is very arrogant, and she does act like a spoiled brat. And she just commands people to do things. She has no ability to have diplomacy. She has no ability other than just using force, other than either ordering people or being a complete pushover. She doesn't have any ability to lead. Jon's a lot better at compromising and getting people to work together and that kind of thing. But once again, Jon has a similar issue where he's too weak and people just walk all over him. So we can see Dany starting to sour on the whole thing. She's lost a large portion of her army. 2 of her dragons are dead. Things are not looking very well. A couple of her best friends are dead. Cersei didn't help her out in the Battle of Ice and Fire, or the Battle for the Dawn, if you will. And she's pissed off. Further to that, everybody close to her betrays her. She told Jon not to tell anybody that he was Aegon, which she immediately goes and tells people who then betray Jon. So not only did Jon betray her, but the people Jon trusts betrayed Jon. So she can't trust Jon, and she can't trust the people that Jon trusts. Then when Tyrion hears about it, literally her right-hand man, he doesn't talk to her. He goes to Varys and they plot their coup. They're like, oh, should we launch a coup against her or not? And it's like, okay, so basically everybody close to her has either died or they're complete pieces of shit who lie to her and do shit behind her back, and Jon's a threat to her power, and Jon is like two-faced because he's saying, oh, you're my queen, I follow you, but when it comes to like doing something that's necessary for her to remain queen, he refuses to. He ant zones her, etc. So basically everybody is either screwed with her, she has no idea what the hell's going on, and then we come to the episode, and we come to her having her psychotic breakdown and just blowing King's Landing up. And it didn't make any sense. Like, I could see her feeding Tyrion to her dragon. Like, like, what would have been a better reaction? Because it's one thing for me to sit here and say the show sucks. How would I have done it better? Okay, I wouldn't have left this to the second last episode. You have no time to deal with anything now. So I think it would have made sense if Dany had have killed the surrendering Lannister soldiers. That didn't bother me because she's pissed off. I think it should have happened after a very long and bloody battle where maybe Wormtongue and or whatever his name, Grey Worm, and like a bunch of the other Unsullied died. Maybe a couple other named characters died. And she was just angry, and they surrendered basically after they'd already lost. And she just said, you should have bowed when you had the chance, and then burned them. And then had an episode or two where Dany's just kind of become paranoid, and she just starts cleaning house. She just starts killing or burning everybody who had worked with Cersei. She starts like revoking all the lordships and replacing them with her own people. Maybe with like Dothraki and like unsullied lords she imposes on the Westerosi and stuff like that. And she just becomes incredibly paranoid. Like, that would make sense to me. That would be a logical character progression. Dany slaughtering the upper class, slaughtering the people who, in her mind, did actually betray her, makes sense. Just randomly killing people doesn't. And then if we want to kind of go on, and we had like a full season to explore this, the obvious parallel to Daenerys is Aegon the Unlikely. They both have very similar backgrounds. They both have very similar, I guess you could say, kind of character arcs. So for those of you who haven't read the books, particularly the Dunk and Egg, Aegon the Unlikely was the brother of Maester Aemon, the younger brother. He's called Aegon the Unlikely because he was very low in the line of succession. I think he was like the third or fourth. I think he was like the fifth son of a fifth son or something. So because no one expected him to be king, he was allowed to go and explore the world with Sir Duncan the Tall. So they would Duncan was a hedge knight, so they'd sleep under hedges, they'd sleep in inns, they ate beef, they'd hang out with the peasants. And Aegon the Unlikely grew up knowing what the average person lived like. He didn't grow up in a palace, he didn't grow up surrounded by luxury. He saw the way the average person lived, and he was filled with compassion for them. And all he wanted to do when he became king was to make things better for them, to improve their conditions, to reduce the taxes they paid, to protect them so lords couldn't abuse them, etc. And he initially started off with these very noble ideas. And once again, this is very similar to Dany. He went through kind of similar experiences she did. She's seen what it's like to be at the bottom, to be begging for things, to have no friends in the world. She's seen the way slaves live. She's seen how the rich oppress the poor, all the kind of things that Aegon the Unlikely saw. But when Aegon the Unlikely became king, the problem with Westeros is the Iron Throne is very weak. It can only really work, because the Crown Lands aren't that large, if the ruler has dragons and can enforce their will. But Aegon the Unlikely obviously didn't have dragons. So he just became increasingly bitter and paranoid and upset because he couldn't do the things that he wanted, which frankly I agree with. I think the peasants need a better deal, but that's neither here nor there. So in his desire to do this, he becomes increasingly unhinged. And as he's doing the research, he comes up with this idea to make this giant cache of wildfire and to light it up and to have the dragon eggs come out of it. And that winds up having the tragedy of Summerhall, which kills most of the remaining Targaryens. So why do I say that? Well, that's something we could have done with Dany. We could have had her, okay, she takes the Iron Throne, she does a massive purge, then she starts trying to do these huge reforms just way too fast. She doesn't know how to explain it to people. She doesn't really she can't do any diplomacy. When she just tells people, can't we all get along, and they push back, she just responds with force. Maybe eventually you'll have an uprising against her, and she doesn't know how to deal with it, so she just goes from castle to castle blowing them up. And she just kind of winds up having to rule as a tyrant. The definition of a despot or a tyrant in old Greek political science, is it's someone who rules directly through the people. It's someone who gets rid of all the intermediaries, all the lords, all the elected representatives, and just it's just them and then everybody else. That's where you get the term Oriental despotism. So that would have made sense. And then someone has to put her down because she's just flailing around. But in that case, she's not killing innocent people. She's become a disaster, but she's become a disaster as a natural result of her personality and of the good and bad aspects of her personality. And the people she's killing are the kind of people that she's always killed. But they decided not to do that in this case. And they just had her go crazy. And it's bad writing. And it could have been the potential to have a really deep, meaningful, fascinating tale of the downfall of this girl and of her, like Aegon the Unlikely, coming to power, finally being able to change the world, but then having it all just kind of collapse in front of her due to her own inability and due to the difficulty in dealing with the ingrained system. And then, as kind of with Aegon the Unlikely, the person who did succeed in making things better for the small folk was King Jaehaerys. And then maybe you have Jon or Tyrion or someone else who's a bit more mild come in and make a lot of the same reforms, but in a much more measured way that will actually stick in the long term. That's how I would have written it at any rate. I think Dany could make a very good tragic figure, but they decided not to do that and they just made her into a villain overnight. So I think it was a bad idea. I think it was a massive misstep. And yeah, I hope